Okay, so this is a supplement to the Cold War lecture because the sound didn't take on some of those cards, for which I apologize. All right, so the Cold War is essentially two poles in the world. The marriage of convenience in the Second World War has broken down, and now the Soviet Union is faced off against the United States. And there's lots of countries allied with the Soviet Union, and there's lots of countries allied with the United States. All right? And these two powers do not like each other very much. So why did they never go to war? Okay, well, they never went to war because they both had nuclear weapons. Not just atomic weapons, but nuclear weapons, thermonuclear weapons, all right? Hydrogen bombs. You can read up on those. They're many more times powerful than the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, all right? And both sides had way more money than they needed, and they also had a variety of delivery systems. Okay, the classic image of nuclear weapons are that they're on warheads on missiles in silos in the Dakotas, right? And the president would he'd have was behind him at all times with the so-called football, right, which was a suitcase with the launch codes in it. And so if he needed to launch a nuclear weapon at war, he would do that. But it never came to be. Actually, the nuclear missiles were only the one way of delivering, of nuking the Soviet Union. We also had B-52s flying at all times with nuclear weapons. And at a given point, they could all attack their targets. And we also had nuclear-powered submarines in the oceans. And they, too, had nuclear weapons on them, and they could surface and hit their targets in the Soviet Union. So, why is this? Why do we spend all this money on this? Okay? Well, the answer is that no matter if they were to strike first, okay, supposing they were to blindside us and nuke everything in the continental United States. Well, too bad for them. Enough of our nukes would survive and the means of delivering them that we could retaliate. All right, and we would inflict unacceptable damage on them in response. Okay, and so this is known as mutually assured destruction. No one ever struck first because it would be a Pyrrhic victory. In fact, it wouldn't be a victory at all. You too would get nuked. So no one ever struck first. So it was a very, that it kept the peace really. But it wasn't a very peaceful time. I mean, it was a very tense time. In the back of everyone's head, there was this notion that something stupid would happen, and all of a sudden we'd have a nuclear war, and that would be it. The world would be over in an afternoon. All right, and you're probably aware of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We came very close to a nuclear war there on account of brinksmanship. All right, the Soviets were going to put nuclear missiles in Cuba, and we said we didn't want them there, and so we objected, and we said we'll launch an attack if you don't dismantle that, and eventually they did dismantle it. All right, if you want to see a movie about that, have that look at that 13 Days movie. We got rid of nuclear weapons in eastern Turkey as the result of that too. That wasn't widely publicized at the time. All right. So mutually assured destruction. A first strike would always be answered, so no one struck first. But it was, as I say, it was a very tense time. People were in the backs of everyone's mind. There was this notion that. Cuban Missile Crisis. Have a look at Google Able Archer sometime in 1983. The Soviets were convinced that the West was attacking them, and they had their nuclear missiles on high alert. But it turns out it was just a a NATO exercise that they had misinterpreted. Okay? So, let's not write history with the end in mind. The world could have gone up in flames. Instead, all right, there's a great deal of the Cold War was fought in the field of espionage. All right, there are all sorts of spy novels about Cold War espionage. It was the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, versus the KGB, which was the Soviet intelligence agency. So not only would they spy on each other, they would engage in all kinds of counterintelligence, all kinds of subversion. You would try to fund dissident groups on the other side. You would try to feed misinformation, trying to undermine their confidence in their system, and so on. And then any chance that we could take to prove the superiority of our system, we would take. Okay, so I've got the space race there, right? The space race. The Soviets were winning the space race. They were the ones, they put up a first satellite around the world. They put a first human around or in orbit around the planet. They landed something on the moon before we did, but we put humans on the moon and got them back safely before the Soviets did. Okay, so they were winning for most of the race, and then in the home stretch we sort of overtook them, and won the race. And so we've just celebrated the 50th anniversary last year of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walking on the moon. And they left a plaque saying, "We came in peace for all mankind," but they might as well have said, "Screw you, commies, we got here first," because really that's what the space race was about. The Olympics as well, that was a huge venue for competition between the free world and the communist world, right? And then we would, we boycotted the Moscow Olympics of 1980 on account of the invasion of Afghanistan. But then that just meant that they boycotted the Olympics of 1984 in Los Angeles. All right. So things like this would play out between the Soviets and the Americans. The Cold War did get hot in the Third World. Okay, in fact, the whole concept of the Third World comes to us from the Cold War. America and its allies were the First World. The Soviet Union and its allies was the Second World, and the Third World was everyone else. A lot of former colonies now granted independence, and actually pretty poor, right? They're developing nations. Two big examples of this are Korea and Vietnam, both of which were divided after the Second World War for the same reason that Germany was divided. The Soviets got one, and the other side was quote unquote ours. All right, and so these divisions were illegitimate, and the Soviets never tried to take West Germany or even West Berlin. They knew better than that. But through their proxies, they tried to take over South Korea, and they tried to take over South Vietnam as well. Obviously, Korea was fought to a draw. North Korea is still with us. All right. Vietnam was not a draw. Okay. Ultimately, the North took over the South. So Vietnam was united, and it was communist. Despite we fought directly in that one, right? We sent all kinds of troops and materiel and lost some 50,000 young men in that fight, all for nothing, really. Vietnam, while officially communist, though, is kind of like China. They have embraced market reforms, and now, you can go to Vietnam, and we're kind of friends with Vietnam. Angola and Mozambique. Okay, see, this is the thing. If you were clever, if you represented a third world country and you were clever, you could play off the Soviet Union and the United States. And you could, you could go to the Soviets and say, "Give us foreign aid," and then you'd go to the United States and say, "The Soviets just gave us this foreign aid. Why don't you match that?" Okay, and so we would be in competition with the Soviets for influence in a given country, and they were some countries were very clever about extorting aid from both sides. If you were unlucky, okay, you ended up like Angola or Mozambique, whereby the government of a country was allied with the Soviets, which meant that all the rebel groups in the country were allied with America, or vice versa. All right? And the Soviets would prop up the government. Meanwhile, the CIA is funding money and arms to the rebels. And you had an endemic civil war, all right? All for the sake of fighting the Cold War. There were a lot of sort of innocent victims of this throughout the world. And that's in Africa. How about in North America, in Latin America, rather? All right. We viewed Latin America as part of our sphere of influence, okay, which meant that, how dare the Soviets do anything. El Salvador, okay, we propped up the government there. Meanwhile, the rebels were funded by the Soviet Union. The precise opposite occurred in Nicaragua. When the Sandinistas took power, we funded the Contra rebels. All right? Again, lots of, and it exposed us as hypocrites, really, because we claim to be, we believe in freedom, we believe in democracy. Meanwhile, we're propping up all these regimes whose sole virtue was that they weren't communist. They were brutal military dictatorships, but at least they weren't communist, right? And so we lost a lot of face in Latin America over the course of the Cold War, for propping up the government of El Salvador. In Chile, we ousted, or the CIA helped to oust, a democratically elected leader named Salvador Allende and put in his place a military strongman by the name of Augusto Pinochet, who ruled throughout the 70s and then into the 80s. And, Chile was one of these countries where people disappeared and they were tortured to death and they were tranquilized and then thrown out of helicopters into the ocean. I mean, it was one of these places, but at least Pinochet wasn't communist, right? All right. So why is all of this? Why did we do this? Can't we all just get along? They have their system and we have our system. Why are we bothering with this? A lot of people at the time asked this. They felt like this is basically a little boys game. Our country was run by a bunch of little boys, and theirs was too, and we're all trying to seek advantage for what? For no real reason. Okay. I think that's a little bit of a caricature. I think that, first of all, the Soviet Union was explicitly expansionist, and we didn't like that. We didn't believe in their vision of equality. Okay? We believed more in freedom, equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome. Obviously, if we have freedom, ultimately some people are going to do better out of it than others, and so we have inequality here. And what's going on in the Soviet Union? Well, you cannot enforce equality without some form of oppression, all right? So, of course, we made a big deal out of their system of gulags, okay? Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote a book called The Gulag Archipelago, which was smuggled out of the Soviet Union, and we published it in the West, and it was like, aha, see the true nature of communism. They, on the other hand, when there's race riots in Detroit in the 60s, they made huge deal about that. And they would show to their people in newsreels, see what happens in America. It's just this terrible place where there's all kinds of inequality and people are rioting all the time. Actually, Soviet citizens took the wrong lesson. They went to the theater to see these newsreels about riots in Detroit and Chicago and Watts and whatnot. And they were absolutely flabbergasted to see that even people in slums had cars. Okay. So yeah, this was always the problem with the Soviet Union. all sort of production was geared towards, well, it wasn't, there was a demand for consumer goods, but they just weren't being met. Okay, the Soviet Union didn't particularly care about this sort of thing. There were periods of so-called détente, okay, kind of periods of truce, all right, but then things would always start up again. Under Jimmy Carter, that was a period of détente, but then Brezhnev invaded Afghanistan in 1980. And so, boy, the Cold War was back on. There was, of course, the Miracle on Ice of 1980. That was a great Cold War victory, wasn't it? When the United States Olympic hockey team defeated the Soviet Olympic hockey team in Lake Placid. But yeah, I mean, there was always things would start up again. They would do something, or we would do something, and the other side would take offense, and we're back on with the Cold War. Okay, obviously this comes to an end at some point, um, starting in 1989. Okay, in Eastern Europe, the Warsaw Pact countries threw off communism. And the revolutions then spread to the Soviet socialist republics like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine. And then finally, in December of 91, to Russia itself, when basically the Russian Communist Party voted itself out of existence. Okay, now how did this happen? I mean, no one saw it coming, really. Even the CIA thought that the USSR would go on indefinitely. Why did it all implode like this? Well, you know, again, let's not write history with the end in mind. Maybe it could have. Maybe it's the butterfly effect, right? One little change caused all of this to happen. But really, there was a huge gap between the image and the reality when dealing with the Soviet Union. We've talked about socialist realism, right? All that commie propaganda of people sort of marching in lockstep towards some goal. The Soviet Union was very good at portraying this image of like singleness of purpose and sort of everyone's equal and everyone's happy here and this is wonderful. And they published all these statistics about how they overfulfilled the tractor production quota for the fifth year plan and all this stuff, right? But in reality, anyone who actually got to go there, looked around, saw that it didn't quite match the image it presented of itself. All right, everything seemed to be falling apart. All right, um, and really, there was no free market in the Soviet Union. Everything was sort of all economic decisions were made in Moscow, right, in the Ministry of the Economy, basically. They would dictate how much got produced in which factory where. And, you know, what is it? There was a joke in the Soviet Union. We pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. All right. So lots of stuff got made that there was no market for. People got paid the same whether it was any good or not. So a lot of the stuff was just crap. All right. And it was just, the whole thing was just held together with chewing gum and binder twine. Okay, the Soviet Union looked formidable from the outside, but inside it was just sort of rotting. All right, so at this point you should go back and look at the remaining slides in the main presentation.